So I think we understand Canada as a country that is relatively open in terms of its attitude toward newcomers, relatively liberal immigration laws, but also very generous provisions of citizenship, access to citizenship, to formal citizenship. And for many years it was one of the most liberal countries. Now other countries are catching up. There is generally a trend across countries toward fewer years of residence requirement, for example. But the idea, and this kind of goes with Canada's history and DNA as a settler state, where immigrants from the very beginning of nation building had arrived and had been recruited to settle a continent, to displace indigenous populations, and to set up a European society on Turtle Island, as traditional name is for the continent. And so that attitude of immigrants being there to contribute to this new society, the settler society, I think that's pretty deeply baked into Canadian DNA. And you see that also in immigration laws, in integration supports. So unlike most countries, I would say that Canada has a very well organized and federally funded immigrant and refugee integration system. So in the United States, for example, most organizations are more grassroots and get their funds from all sorts of sources, but not from the federal government. In Canada, there's a heavy reliance on the federal government in integration funding, and integration supports for newcomers are really wide-ranging, from anything labor market integration to, very importantly, English or French language acquisition, support with accessing medical services. You even have settlement support programs in public schools to support the children of immigrants in schools. So there's a lot of provision there that's pretty well coordinated, and that every few years there's a new round of funding applications to the federal government, and based on new priorities that are, so there's a very tight interweaving between government policy and the integration services offered.
At the same time, these organizations are often independent. They're community-based. They receive their funding, but they are not state agencies in the strict sense of the meaning, right? So there is a collaboration between a community-based network of organizations on the ground and the federal government in terms of funding, right? So that's also a unique aspect, I think, of the Canadian system.
And it's a very heterogeneous group of organizations. Some are really professionalized, really large organizations that have satellite offices and all they do is provide services for newcomers. Others are in organizations like neighborhood houses that provide services also for anyone in the neighborhood, and then servicing immigrants is part of that mandate. And they are much more grassroots, based on volunteer labor. So there is a lot of variation. Some are traditionally focused on one particular ethnic community, but have become now service providers for all communities, but that's still there in a lot of the tradition of these organizations. Others started out just as general serving the public. I mean, Canadian citizenship is very young. It's only 1947 that there is such a thing as Canadian citizenship that's independent of British status. So you have this very long colonial legacy in citizenship law. And so starting in 1947, then we see that you had to really implement naturalization procedures. And for a long time, it was based on an interview with an immigration judge. And you had to show knowledge of Canadian society. But it was very ill-defined what exactly that meant. There were study guides, but there was a lot of discretion that judges had in terms of those interviews. There was also for a long time preferential treatment of British citizens who were exempt from many of these requirements until the mid-70s, I believe. And then in 1994, the system changed significantly by moving from an interview-based process to a test-based process. And so now every candidate for naturalization will use a study guide to prepare for a test, and then has to take the test unless they're over a certain age. Another important change was that you used to be able to have that interview with a judge and also take the test initially with the help of an interpreter. And now it's a requirement that you have to take the test in either English or French. So that raised the hurdle for newcomers, and language is a big access barrier. In the 2010s, there was a new guide that was established, which was much, much longer than any previous guide before, and more arduous to actually work through, also different ideological inflections, but that is true for just about every guide. And so it has become more difficult, I would say, to act. It's more work to access citizenship. The fees were raised as well under the previous Canadian government, the Harper government, and they have remained that high. So it's not insignificant, especially if a family wants to naturalize. And one thing we have seen a significant decline in naturalization in Canada. So for a long time, Canada really was a world leader with citizenship rates well over 80%, which is very, very high. And they're still very high compared to other countries, but they're on a downward trajectory. And actually one project I'm working on is trying to understand why is that happening. And we don't have the answers yet, but there certainly is evidence that suggests that the policy changes that put additional hurdles in the way certainly had an impact. But there are other factors as well. It's not quite as simplistic as that. That is such a complex question.
I know.
And there's so many different layers to that. I think at a very fundamental level, if you acknowledge that, the settlement here has happened on Indigenous lands, then you could advance a critique that continued immigration, continued settlement is a perpetuation of that dynamic if it does not happen in cooperation with Indigenous nations, if Indigenous nations don't have a say over immigration policy, which currently there are consultations between IRCC, the Federal Immigration Department, and some representative bodies of Indigenous nations. But it's a consultative exercise that some would argue doesn't have a lot of true meaning attached to it. So on the fundamental level, I think you could say it's a fundamentally flawed it's a really flawed relationship that any difference you make does not get at that fundamental tension. So I want to just have that acknowledged in terms of what I'm about to say. So one big question is, how can you disrupt the dynamic where immigrants arrive here, settle, and assimilate into Canadian society in ways that perpetuate colonial dynamics? A lot of work has been done in Canada since the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was published in terms of, decolonizing the curriculum, educating especially high school students, but also university students in terms of the impacts of the Indian residential school system, the history of colonization, and ongoing impacts of that, the Indian Act. But for newcomers who arrive here, there's nothing. The socialization has happened elsewhere. And in the work that we do, we hear over and over again that newcomers arrive with a very, very positive conception of Canada. And because Canada has this positive image internationally as a multicultural, an open, a peace-loving country, and often being contrasted with the United States on those measures. And then immigrants arrive here, and especially when we're looking at immigrants, refugees from formerly colonized parts of the global south arrive here, and it's a shock when they realize that they haven't gotten away from colonial legacies. They're just in a different context of settler colonialism. And people would say, people would arrive and say, what are these shoes doing here? Asking questions about the memorials that emerged after all the evidence about the undisclosed graves in Kamloops were published, and learning about the Indian residential school system and just being shocked, like really fundamentally shocked, because it totally challenged even the motivation for coming here as a better place and escaping, some certain legacies. And so there's that situation of immigrants, at least some immigrants, really grappling with what does it mean to be here, and does my presence just contribute to the harm that exists structurally. And so one project that we've been working with some Squamish elders, the Squamish Nation is one of the local nations on whose land Vancouver is built, is to have dialogue groups where newcomers get together in small circles and elders come and officially welcome them to the territory. And that's actually been extremely powerful. There is a recognition that those elders have an authority that the Canadian state does not have in the same way. And oftentimes newcomers who are racialized and who have really been struggling with feeling excluded, feeling racialized in Vancouver, having that welcome by a local elder has been very, very powerful. And then with that, there's teaching of pre-contact history of the nation, of the impact of colonization, but also today what's happening because these are vibrant communities, right? That this is part of Vancouver's fabric today, and there's so many exciting things happening. And so that's been really, it's been powerful to see that connection building and how that offers us a sense of belonging to newcomers who are struggling with setting down roots in Vancouver. Well, I'm going to first answer, not focus on practices, but actually focusing on engagement with colonialism, because I think among European countries, right, Germany stands out in terms of having really done a lot of work in terms of kind of coming to terms with the past in relation to the Holocaust education and questions of what does it mean in terms of society or how society has to change. But a lot less work has been done on colonization in most European countries. And I think for European societies to engage with the past of colonialism and the legacy, if that was to happen meaningfully, I think it would really open up whole new conversations between immigrants and refugees arriving to Europe today, because it would be a recognition of these relationships that have a very long history. And this kind of image of Europe as this white continent where now newcomers are trying to join, I think that would be fundamentally questioned in terms of seeing how these connections across continents have been part of European social and political life for so long. And so I think that could potentially decrease the distance, right, between, and also create new claims of membership and even territorial belonging for those from countries where there are all these legacies of colonial connections in the past. So that's kind of a general point in terms of education about colonialism. In terms of practices, I think one institution that I think is wonderful in Canada is, or at least in big cities, is the neighborhood houses and community centers where everybody in a neighborhood or a location is invited to participate, whether that's kind of classes or really community building groups. And this is where oftentimes newcomers meet those who've been here for longer and form relationships. And I think it's things happen organically in a way that are hard to recreate through very structured kind of public policy programs. So I think creating space for community, creating space where people just meet each other as neighbors, not as immigrants or other kind of positionalities. I think more so than most other immigrant groups, refugees in Canada have, arrive with fewer resources in terms of financial resources. Those who are resettled by the Canadian government arrive with debt. They owe the government the money that the government loaned them to pay for the flight to come to Canada. They have a pretty relatively short period of time to repay that money. So refugees are forced to right away try to find employment with much less time to invest in language acquisition. There's this real trade-off between employment and language acquisition, which in the long term, right, you would say it's more favorable. It's better if you invest in language acquisition because in the long run, that will pay off economically. That's a really hard thing to do in that situation. There's, of course, also the trauma of what you leave behind and oftentimes having family still in that place. So I think it is a in-between space that is really hard to navigate. And then you put this in a context like the big Canadian cities where the cost of living is prohibitively high, where housing typically is found far from the hub of activity, and that can increase social isolation. If it's a larger family of refugees, very hard to find housing that is not substandard. So there are challenges that, and oftentimes refugees arrive here are not fluent in English or in French. So you have additional challenges. And despite the existence of government programs or community organizations funded to support them, it is still really hard to do. On top of that, it is a fact that most refugees are racialized in Canada. And so there also are experiences of exclusion and discrimination for sure.